Hello, and welcome back, dear listener. Settle in, perhaps with a warm cup of tea, because tonight's tale is one for a quiet evening by the fire. It is December, in a snowbound corner of the English countryside, where a great old manor house sits half-buried under the heaviest fall of snow anyone can remember. Inside, a small party of guests has gathered for the holidays. Old friends, old grudges, and one elderly visitor who notices rather more than she lets on. By midnight, the snow lies thick and untouched across the garden, and a man lies dead in the middle of it, with not a single footprint leading to or from the body. The local constable calls it impossible. Miss Marple simply calls it interesting. Now then, let us begin. Snowfall at the manor. The snow had been falling since Thursday afternoon, and by the time Miss Jane Marple's train drew into the small station at Larkspur Halt, the whole world beyond the carriage window had been smoothed into a single sheet of white, broken only by the dark stitching of hedgerows and the occasional black shape of a rook standing miserably on a fence post. "Dreadful weather for travelling," said the porter, an elderly man with a moustache gone yellow at the edges from pipe smoke, as he heaved her case down onto the platform. "You'll be for the manor, I expect, miss. Not many else comes out this way in December." "I am indeed," said Miss Marple, drawing her coat more closely about her thin shoulders. "Mrs. Hartwell was kind enough to invite me for Christmas. We were at school together, you know, though that was a very long time ago." The porter regarded her with the particular respect that country people reserve for the genuinely old, and went to fetch the pony trap that would carry her the 1.5 miles up the hill to Larkspur Manor. It was, Miss Marple thought as the trap creaked along the lane, a singularly beautiful sort of bleakness, the bare elms standing black against a sky the colour of pewter, the snow not yet marked by so much as a rabbit's track. She had always been fond of snow in moderation. It made the village look, for a few days at least, exactly like the pictures on the Christmas cards her great-nephew Raymond was forever sending her, the sort with robins and holly that he privately considered rather beneath his literary taste, but sent anyway because he knew she liked them. Larkspur Manor itself appeared at the top of the rise rather suddenly, the way old houses do when the lane bends. A long grey stone building with mullioned windows and too many chimneys, the kind of house that had clearly been added to by at least 4 generations of Hartwells, none of whom had troubled to consult the others about matters of architectural harmony. Smoke rose from several of the chimneys, and through the gathering dusk, the windows glowed a warm, welcoming yellow. Mrs. Hartwell, Dorothy, as she had been 40 years ago in the schoolroom at Miss Lavender's establishment for young ladies, though now everyone called her Dolly, met her at the door herself, which Miss Marple thought rather touching, given that there must have been at least 2 servants idle enough to do it instead. "Jane, my dear, you must be frozen quite through. Come in, come in. The fire's going beautifully in the drawing room, and Henry's just got the sherry out." Dolly Hartwell had grown stout and rather grey since their school days, but her eyes were the same, quick, kind, and just faintly anxious, as though she expected something to go wrong at any moment, and wanted to be ready for it. The drawing room, when Miss Marple was shown into it, was already populated by a small assortment of guests, arranged about the fire in the comfortable disorder of people who have known each other, to varying degrees, for some years. There was Henry Hartwell himself, red-faced and hearty, pouring sherry, with the slightly overdone good cheer of a man who has had rather a bad year financially and is determined nobody shall suspect it. There was his nephew, Gerald Hartwell, a tall, restless young man of perhaps 30, who stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the snow with an expression Miss Marple could not quite place. Boredom, perhaps, or something rather more like resentment. In the armchair nearest the fire sat an older man Dolly introduced as Colonel Ashworth, a neighbour from the next estate, who had apparently come to dine and been persuaded, on account of the weather, to stay the night rather than risk the roads. He had the weathered, slightly choleric look of a man who had spent 30 years in India complaining about the heat and now spent his retirement complaining about the cold. And there, perched rather uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa, as though she did not quite belong there, which Miss Marple gathered within the first 5 minutes, she rather felt she didn't, sat a young woman introduced as Miss Felicity Vane, who turned out to be Gerald's fiancée, and who had the particular brittle brightness of someone determined to make a good impression on people who have not yet decided to like her. "You must be exhausted after the journey," said Dolly, settling Miss Marple into a chair with the air of a woman arranging a difficult piece of furniture. "The trains have been simply chaotic. We very nearly didn't think you'd manage it at all, what with the forecast." "Oh, I find trains rather restful," said Miss Marple placidly. "One has so much time simply to watch the country going by, and to think." "Think about what, I wonder?" said Gerald, turning from the window with a faint, not entirely friendly smile. He had the look, Miss Marple thought, of a young man who found old ladies either charming or tedious, and had not yet decided which category to place her in. "Oh, this and that," said Miss Marple vaguely, accepting a small glass of sherry from Henry Hartwell with a murmur of thanks. "I find that in a place like St. Mary Mead, one does a great deal of thinking, simply for want of anything else to do. One notices things, small things mostly. It becomes a sort of habit." "How frightfully dull that sounds," said Felicity Vane, with a brittle little laugh, and looked immediately as though she wished she hadn't said it. "Not dull at all, my dear," said Miss Marple, smiling at her with what appeared to be perfect good humour. "You would be surprised how very much there is to notice, once one starts looking." There was a small, odd pause after this. The kind of pause, Miss Marple thought, that occurs not because anyone has said anything particularly remarkable, but because something in the room has shifted very slightly, like a draught, from a door no one remembers opening. Colonel Ashworth cleared his throat and began to talk, rather loudly, about the state of the roads. Henry Hartwell laughed too heartily at nothing in particular. Gerald turned back to the window and the falling snow. Miss Marple sipped her sherry and said nothing further, but she had already begun, in her quiet and entirely unobtrusive way, to watch. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft, steady, and utterly silent, smoothing the lawn below the window into an unbroken white sheet, erasing the gravel path, the flower beds, the low stone wall that marked the edge of the garden. By morning, Miss Marple thought idly, there would not be a mark on it anywhere. She had no notion, of course, of how very significant that particular thought would turn out to be. Dinner that evening was a pleasant enough affair, though Miss Marple, who had spent the better part of 70 years cultivating the art of appearing to listen to one conversation while attending quite closely to another, noticed several small things she filed away without quite knowing why. She noticed that Henry Hartwell drank rather more wine than a man with gout ought to, and that his wife watched him do it with an anxiety that went beyond mere wifely concern. She noticed that Gerald and Felicity, though seated next to one another, spoke to each other scarcely at all, and that when they did, there was a peculiar carefulness to it, like two people stepping around a hole in the floor. She noticed that Colonel Ashworth, for all his bluster about the roads, seemed in no great hurry to be on them, and asked Dolly twice, in what he no doubt believed was a casual manner, whether the spare room had a good lock on the door. By the time the ladies withdrew and left the gentlemen to their port, the snow outside had thickened considerably, and the wind had begun to rise, sending small flurries against the window panes, with a sound like someone scratching very gently to be let in. Miss Marple, sitting by the drawing-room fire with her knitting, she had brought, as always, a half-finished jumper, intended eventually for one of Raymond's children, reflected that it was, on the whole, a very pleasant house party, and that she could not for the life of her say why she felt so distinctly that something in it was wrong. She would have cause, before the night was very much older, to understand exactly why. The body in the garden. It was Annie, the young housemaid, who found him, a little after 8 the next morning, when she went out to the side garden to fetch in the milk that the dairyman had left, as he always did, just inside the low gate. Miss Marple, who had risen early out of long habit, and was standing at her bedroom window admiring the extraordinary purity of the snow. It had stopped falling sometime in the small hours, leaving the whole garden smooth and gleaming under a thin, pale sun. heard the scream quite clearly through the glass. It was not a long scream, nor a particularly loud one, but it had in it that particular quality, unmistakable to anyone who has heard it before, of a person who has come upon something no amount of country living has prepared them for. By the time Miss Marple had got down the stairs, not quickly, for her hip did not permit quickly, but with a steady determination that covered ground rather faster than one might expect, a small huddle of people had already gathered at the side door in dressing gowns and hastily pulled on coats. Henry Hartwell, his face the colour of the snow itself, Dolly, with one hand pressed to her mouth, Gerald, white and oddly rigid, and Annie, sobbing into her apron while the cook attempted, without much success, to lead her away. Miss Marple did not push forward. She had found, over a long lifetime, that one saw a very great deal more by standing quietly at the back of a crowd than by forcing one's way to the front of it, and besides, her hip really would not have permitted forcing. What she saw, over the shoulders of the others, was this. In the middle of the side lawn, a stretch of perhaps 40 feet between the house and the low stone wall that separated the garden from the orchard beyond, lay the body of a man, face down, one arm flung out before him, the snow around his head darkened in a way that left no doubt at all as to what had happened to him. "It's Mr. Drummond," said Henry Hartwell, in a voice that did not sound entirely like his own. "Good God, it's Drummond." "Who is Mr. Drummond?" Miss Marple asked, of no one in particular, in the mild and faintly apologetic tone she generally used when asking questions she very much wanted answered. It was Colonel Ashworth, arriving at that moment with his coat thrown hastily over his pyjamas, who answered her. "Solicitor. Hartwell's solicitor, and mine too, as it happens, drove out from the village yesterday afternoon, before the worst of the snow set in, to go over some papers with Henry. I understood he meant to drive back before dark. He never got the chance," said Henry heavily. "The roads were already going by 4 o'clock. I told him he'd best stop the night. We'd plenty of room, and he agreed readily enough. Went up to bed about 11, same as the rest of us." He stopped, swallowed, and seemed to make himself look again at the thing lying in the snow. What in God's name was he doing out here? It was, Miss Marple reflected, a perfectly reasonable question, and the answer to it, when it eventually came, was to prove very much more interesting than anyone in that shivering little group could have imagined. The local constable, a solid, unimaginative young man named Hobbs, who arrived on a bicycle some 40 minutes later, breathing hard and clearly aware that this was a very much larger matter than anything he had previously been called upon to handle, took one look at the scene and immediately telephoned for the inspector from the county town, a Detective Inspector Reed, who arrived a little after 11, brisk, dark-suited, and visibly irritated at having his morning interrupted by what he plainly hoped would prove to be a simple accident. It was, however, Constable Hobbs, standing rather awkwardly at the edge of the lawn with his bicycle clip still on, who first gave voice to the thing that everyone had been carefully not saying. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said to Inspector Reed, "but I've had a good look round, and I can't make it out at all. There's no tracks. Not one. Not leading to him, not leading away. Just him, lying there, and nothing else touching the snow anywhere near him." Inspector Reed gave him a look that suggested he thought the constable had perhaps not looked very hard, and walked the perimeter of the lawn himself, his own footprints making a neat dark trail in the white. He came back rather more thoughtfully than he had set out. "He's right," Reed admitted, half to himself. Snow stopped falling, according to the housekeeper, somewhere around 3 in the morning. Body's been out here some hours. Doctor'll confirm time of death, but rigor's well advanced. I'd say he died not long after midnight. And in all that time, not so much as a cat's been across this lawn." He looked round at the assembled household, his expression sharpening considerably. "Which means either this man flew here, or somebody's playing a very clever game indeed." Miss Marple, standing a little apart with her hands folded over the handle of her umbrella, found herself looking not at the body, which she had, in the manner of her generation, already decided was not a sight to dwell upon longer than necessary, but at the faces of the people around her. It was, she had long believed, in faces rather than in footprints, that the truth of these things generally lay, though she would have been the first to admit that footprints, or the curious absence of them, did present a most arresting puzzle. "How very extraordinary," she murmured to Dolly Hartwell, who stood beside her shivering. Whether from cold or from shock it was difficult to say. "One does rather wonder how he came to be there at all, with the snow so very undisturbed." "I don't understand any of it," said Dolly, in a small, frightened voice, quite unlike her usual brisk hostess manner. "He was perfectly well at dinner, perfectly ordinary. We talked about the church roof fund of all things." She pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. "Jane, I do wish you hadn't had to see this. I'm so dreadfully sorry." "Not at all, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "I am very glad to be here, if I can be of any use to you at all." It was not, perhaps, the most tactful thing to say, within sight of a dead man. But Dolly seemed to take a measure of comfort from it nonetheless, and pressed her old friend's hand gratefully. Inspector Reed, meanwhile, had crouched down beside the body with the police doctor, who had arrived shortly after him on similarly hazardous roads, and the two of them spoke in low, professional tones that did not carry to the watching household. After some minutes, Reed straightened, dusted the snow from his knees, and addressed the assembled company with the particular flat formality of a man about to say something none of them would care to hear. "I'll want everyone who was in this house last night to remain here until further notice," he said. "Nobody leaves Larkspur Manor, and nobody," he added, with a glance that swept the unmarked white expanse of the lawn, "is to set foot on this garden until my men have had a proper look at it." He paused, and his eyes moved once more, almost involuntarily, to the smooth and silent snow. "Because somebody in this house," he said slowly, "put that man there last night, and I'll be damned if I can see how they did it without leaving a single mark behind them." Beside Miss Marple, quite unnoticed by anyone except herself, Gerald Hartwell let out a long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it since the moment the scream first sounded through the house. The household gathers. By 1:30, Inspector Reed had commandeered the small morning room at the back of the house. A sunny little chamber in summer, no doubt, though on this particular December day it seemed to Miss Marple a singularly cheerless place in which to be questioned about a murder, and had begun, with the methodical patience of a man building a wall one brick at a time, to interview every member of the household in turn. Miss Marple was not interviewed first, nor did she expect to be. She occupied herself instead with the placid industry of a woman entirely accustomed to waiting, in a corner of the drawing-room with her knitting, where she had an excellent view of the hallway, the morning-room door, and the various comings and goings of a household under siege from its own anxieties. She observed that Felicity Vane, called in second, emerged after only a few minutes looking flushed and oddly defiant, and went immediately to find Gerald, with whom she had a low, urgent conversation by the window that ended, as far as Miss Marple could tell from a distance, and without appearing to look, in Gerald taking her hand rather stiffly, as a man might take the hand of someone he was not entirely certain he wished to be holding. She observed that Colonel Ashworth, when his turn came, went in with his shoulders back and his chin up, like a man reporting to a superior officer, and came out again, some 20 minutes later, considerably less upright than he had gone in. And she observed, though this she filed away with particular care, saying nothing of it to anyone, that Henry Hartwell, waiting his own turn in the hall, took from his waistcoat pocket a small folded paper, looked at it with an expression of real misery, and then, glancing about him to be sure he was unobserved, he did not think to look at the elderly lady apparently absorbed in counting stitches by the drawing-room fire, put it carefully into the heart of the fire in the hall grate, and watched it burn. It was gone before Miss Marple could have said with any certainty what it had been. A letter, she thought, perhaps a bill. It was, she told herself firmly, no business of hers what Henry Hartwell chose to burn in his own grate, and she returned her attention to her knitting with the particular blankness of expression she had cultivated over many decades for occasions exactly like this one. When her own turn came, a little before 3, Inspector Reed regarded her with the faint, not unkind impatience that brisk professional men so often direct at elderly ladies, clearly anticipating a great deal of vague and unhelpful chatter. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Just a few routine questions." "You're a guest here, I understand. Arrived yesterday afternoon." "That is correct, Inspector. I have known Mrs. Hartwell since we were girls together at school, though I confess, that was a very long time ago indeed." "And you retired last night at what time?" "I went up shortly after 11, Inspector, along with most of the household, I believe. I am not, I am afraid, a very late sitter-up these days." She smiled at him with mild, grandmotherly apology. "Though I will say, I did not sleep at once. I find new beds always take a little getting used to, and I lay awake for perhaps 3/4 of an hour, listening to the snow. Hear anything unusual? Voices, footsteps, doors?" Miss Marple considered this with apparent care. "I believe I heard a door close, somewhere along the corridor, perhaps half an hour after I went up, though I could not tell you whose door it was, nor be entirely certain I have the time correct. One's sense of time, lying in the dark, is not always to be relied upon." She paused. "I also heard, a little later, what I took to be someone moving about downstairs. Very faintly, you understand, the way sounds carry oddly in old houses. But I assumed it was simply someone fetching a book, or perhaps Mr. Drummond himself, unable to sleep in a strange bed. One does not, after all, generally suspect such sounds of anything sinister." Reed made a note, his pen moving rather more quickly than it had a moment before. "Can you say what time that was?" "I'm afraid not with any precision, Inspector. Sometime after midnight, I should think, though I had perhaps drifted in and out of sleep by then, and one's judgment in such matters is notoriously poor." She looked at him with an air of mild apology, as though she felt she ought to be able to offer more, and regretted that she could not. In point of fact, Miss Marple was very nearly certain it had been 20 minutes past midnight, having glanced at the small travelling clock on her nightstand at the moment the sound first registered. But she had found, over a very long career of quiet observation, that it was generally wiser to let officials believe one knew rather less than one did. People talked so much more freely, she had discovered, to a woman they believed to be confused. Reed asked her a few further questions. About her acquaintance with the household, with Mr. Drummond. None, she explained truthfully, having never met the man, and with the general temper of the party at dinner, and dismissed her with the slightly relieved air of a man who has found an interview shorter and less taxing than he had feared. It was only as she rose to leave that she paused and said, with apparent diffidence, "I do hope, Inspector, that you will not think me impertinent if I observe one small thing." "Go on," said Reed, not very encouragingly. "It is only that the snow stopped falling, I am told, at about 3 in the morning, and poor Mr. Drummond appears to have died very much earlier than that. Somewhere around midnight, I understand the doctor believes. Which means," she went on, in the mild, unhurried tone of a woman thinking aloud over her knitting, "that whoever placed him there, or caused him to go there, must have done so while the snow was still falling rather heavily. And yet there is no mark anywhere upon that lawn, save where he himself lies. Not so much as where a person might have stood, even briefly, to look at him." "That had occurred to me, Miss Marple," said Reed, a shade dryly. "Of course it had, Inspector. I only mention it because it struck me as rather important. Not the fact that there are no footprints, which I am sure you and your men have considered very thoroughly, but the question of why anyone should have gone to such very great trouble to ensure there were none. It is, after all," she added, gathering up her knitting with the air of a woman concluding a pleasant chat about nothing in particular, "a great deal easier simply to commit a murder than to commit one in a manner calculated to look impossible. One wonders what the murderer hoped to gain by the extra difficulty." She left him with that thought, and Inspector Reed, watching the door close behind her small, neat, retreating figure, found himself sitting rather longer than he had intended before calling in his next witness. By tea-time, the household had reassembled in the drawing-room in a state of subdued and watchful misery. No one quite willing to be alone, no one quite willing to talk freely either. Dolly Hartwell poured tea with hands that shook very slightly. Henry stood by the fire and did not drink his. Gerald and Felicity sat at opposite ends of the sofa, not touching, not speaking, each apparently absorbed in private and unhappy thought. Colonel Ashworth read the same page of the newspaper for the better part of 20 minutes without, Miss Marple was quite certain, taking in a single word of it. It was Miss Marple herself, sitting quietly with her tea and her knitting, who broke the long silence at last, though her words, mild and grandmotherly as they were, seemed to land in that overheated little room like stones dropped into still water. "It is curious, is it not," she said, to no one in particular, "how very often the people who knew a man best are the very last to admit they understood him at all." No one answered her. But Miss Marple noted, with the small private satisfaction of a woman whose remark has found its mark, that 3 separate people in that room had gone very still indeed. Miss Marple's quiet eye. The snow began again that evening, soft and persistent, tapping against the windows like a small reminder that the world outside Larkspur Manor had not stopped simply because a man lay dead in its garden. Though in fact, of course, the garden itself had been roped off by Inspector Reed's constables, who stood about stamping their feet in the cold and looking faintly self-important, guarding a stretch of lawn that nobody in the house had the slightest desire to revisit. Miss Marple, who had excused herself from the drawing-room shortly after dinner on the grounds of fatigue, a fiction nobody troubled to question, since elderly ladies were generally assumed to tire early, and Miss Marple had found this assumption extremely useful on a great many occasions, did not, in fact, go to bed. Instead, she made her way quietly to the small sitting-room beside the library, where she had noticed, the previous evening, a good wing chair positioned just out of sight of the door, but well within earshot of the library itself, where Henry Hartwell habitually retired after dinner with his account books. It was not, she would have been the first to admit, entirely honest of her to sit there with her knitting and listen. But Miss Marple had long ago made her peace with this particular failing in her character, on the grounds that a murder had been committed, and that the ordinary rules of polite behavior rather lost their force in the face of a man lying dead in the snow. She was rewarded, after perhaps 20 minutes, by the sound of Dolly Hartwell's voice, low and urgent, coming from the library. "Henry, you must tell the inspector. You must. If they find out you burned it yourself, it will look 100 times worse than if you simply explain." "Explain what, Dolly?" "That Drummond came out here specifically to tell me my own solicitor believed I'd been systematically defrauding the estate for the better part of 3 years. Henry's voice had a raw, cornered quality Miss Marple had not heard in it before. "That he was going to lay the whole thing before the trustees on Monday? That I had every reason in the world to want him silenced? Good God, woman, do you want them to hang me?" "I want you to tell the truth," said Dolly, "before someone else tells it for you." There was a silence, broken only by the small sound of a glass being set down rather too hard on a table. "I didn't kill him," Henry said at last, in a voice gone suddenly tired. "Whatever you may think of me, Dolly, and I know what you think of me, I've known it for months, I did not kill Edmund Drummond. I burned the letter because I was a coward, and because I am frightened half out of my mind, and because I could not bear for you to read what he'd written and look at me the way you're looking at me now. That is the whole of my crime." Miss Marple, sitting very still in her wing chair with her knitting motionless in her lap, found that she believed him, or rather, found that some considerable part of her believed him, while another, more cautious part, reminded her that she had been wrong about people before, and that frightened men told convincing lies as readily as truthful ones told convincing truths. It was, she reflected later, the first small mistake of her investigation, though she did not recognize it as such at the time. She allowed herself, on the strength of one overheard conversation and the particular timbre of a man's voice, to set Henry Hartwell very nearly aside, as a suspect, to file him, mentally, under the heading of foolish and frightened rather than dangerous, and to turn the greater part of her attention instead to Gerald and Felicity, whose carefully held hands and carefully avoided eyes had struck her, from the first evening, as concealing something a good deal more deliberate than mere financial embarrassment. It would be some days before she came to see how very far that early judgment had led her astray. The next morning, the snow having stopped again some time before dawn, leaving the world once more hushed and white, though this time the garden bore the trampled, ordinary marks of constables going about their business. Miss Marple took herself for a short walk along the drive, ostensibly for the good of her constitution, and fell, with every appearance of accident, into step beside Felicity Vane, who was standing near the gate looking out at the white fields with an expression of real misery. "It is a very trying time for you, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "An engagement is difficult enough, without a murder thrown into the midst of it." Felicity turned to her with a start, as though she had forgotten anyone else was about. "I don't know what you mean." "Only that you and Mr. Hartwell seem to me a young couple under a very great strain," said Miss Marple, with the mild, unthreatening placidity she had perfected over many decades of extracting confidences from people who had not intended to give them. "I am an old woman, my dear, and old women notice these things, though we are generally too polite to say so. I do not ask you to confide in me. I only observe that you looked, last night at dinner, like a young woman carrying a burden a great deal heavier than wedding nerves." Felicity was silent for a long moment, her gloved hands twisting together. Then, in a rush, as though the words had been waiting a long time for somewhere to go, "Gerald owed Mr. Drummond money. A great deal of money, gambling debts mostly, from before we were engaged. Mr. Drummond had been very patient about it, but yesterday afternoon, before dinner, I heard them quarrelling in the study. Gerald was begging him for more time, and Mr. Drummond said—" She stopped. "What did he say, my dear?" "He said that patience was a luxury he could no longer afford on Gerald's account, and that he intended to speak to Gerald's uncle about it directly, that very evening after dinner." Felicity's eyes filled with sudden tears. "I haven't told the inspector. I can't. If they think Gerald had a reason to want him dead, on top of everything else—" There, said Miss Marple, patting her arm with genuine kindness, for whatever her private calculations, she was not a woman entirely without sympathy for the frightened young. "You did right to tell me, and I think you would do better still to tell the inspector yourself, before he learns it from someone else, and wonders why you kept silent. The truth has a way of coming out in these matters, my dear, whatever efforts are made to bury it. Rather, I am reminded, like that poor man's body in the snow, one may delay the discovery. One very rarely prevents it." She left Felicity by the gate, dabbing at her eyes, and walked back toward the house, with her hands folded over the handle of her umbrella, and a small, thoughtful frown upon her face. For she had, in that moment, become very nearly certain that she knew the shape of the crime. That a desperate young man with gambling debts, and an angry solicitor, threatening to expose him to a wealthy uncle, made as neat and complete a motive as any she had encountered in a long career of observing such things. It was, as it turned out, very nearly the right motive, attached to entirely the wrong difficulty, for Miss Marple had not yet asked herself the one question that mattered more than any other, not who wished Edmund Drummond dead, of which there appeared to be a positive abundance of candidates, but how, in the name of all that was reasonable, anyone had contrived to kill him in the middle of an open lawn during a snowstorm without leaving a single mark upon it. That question, she realized with some private annoyance as she climbed the steps to the front door, she had allowed herself to set aside entirely in the satisfaction of having found a motive, and a murder, as she well knew from long experience, was very rarely solved by motive alone. Threads and shadows. Inspector Reed, for his part, had spent the better part of 2 days arriving at very much the same conclusion Miss Marple had reached over a single conversation by the garden gate, and by Thursday afternoon he had summoned Gerald Hartwell to the morning room for what was unmistakably a rather more pointed interview than any that had gone before. Miss Marple, who had developed by this time a quite shameless habit of finding errands that took her past the morning-room door, gathered from the raised voices within, Gerald's, sharp and defensive, Reed's, flat and unrelenting, that the matter of the gambling debts had indeed come to light, and that Gerald's account of his movements on the night of the murder had not improved matters. He had claimed, it transpired, to have gone straight to bed after the rest of the household at 11, and to have slept undisturbed until the scream the following morning. But Annie the housemaid, questioned again that morning, had recalled, with the particular reluctant honesty of servants who do not wish to make trouble but cannot quite bring themselves to lie to a police inspector, that she had seen a light still burning under Mr. Gerald's door as late as midnight, when she herself had gone up to bed after banking the kitchen fire. "A man can leave a light burning and still be asleep," Gerald's voice came, muffled but audible, through the morning-room door. "He can," Reed agreed evenly, "though it's a curious sort of sleep that leaves the boots by the bed wet through with melted snow, when by your own account you never left this house all evening." There was a silence of the sort that Miss Marple, standing very still in the corridor with a vase of dried flowers she had no genuine intention of rearranging, recognized as extremely significant. It was, on the face of it, very damning indeed. Wet boots, a burning light, a documented quarrel with the dead man only hours before his death. A young man deep enough in debt to have every reason in the world to wish his creditor silenced. Miss Marple, turning the matter over in her mind, as she made her unhurried way back to the drawing-room, found herself thinking that Inspector Reed would very likely have his man in custody before the weekend was out, and that the whole sad business would be concluded with a neatness that left her, for reasons she could not entirely articulate even to herself, faintly dissatisfied. It was not that she doubted Gerald capable of murder. She had long ago abandoned any comfortable illusion that young men with good manners and unhappy love affairs were incapable of violence. She had seen too much of human nature in St. Mary Mead and elsewhere to believe anything of the kind. What troubled her was simpler and a good deal more practical. She could not, however she turned the problem about, construct in her mind any plausible account of how Gerald, or anyone else in that house, could have walked Edmund Drummond out onto that lawn, struck him down, and walked away again, all without leaving so much as the print of a single shoe in snow that had, by every account, been falling heavily at the time. Wet boots proved a man had been outside. They did not, by themselves, explain the absence of tracks. She raised this point, with characteristic mildness, to Inspector Reed himself that evening, having contrived to encounter him in the hall as he was preparing to leave for the night. "I do hope you will forgive an old woman's curiosity, Inspector, but I have been wondering, has it occurred to you that Mr. Drummond might not have been killed where he was found at all? That he might have been killed elsewhere, in the house perhaps, and the body carried out afterward?" "It had occurred to me," said Reed, not unkindly, though with the air of a man whose patience for amateur theorizing was finite. "But the doctor's quite firm that he died where he lay. The position of the body, the bleeding, all consistent with him going down right there on the lawn and not being moved afterward. And besides, Miss Marple, carrying a body out onto open snow doesn't solve your footprint problem. It rather makes it worse. A man carrying a body leaves deeper tracks than a man walking alone, not fewer." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Yes, I do see that. It was rather a foolish suggestion of mine. I beg your pardon." She did not, in fact, think it had been a foolish suggestion at all, but she had found that allowing busy professional men to believe they had gently corrected a confused old lady was generally a more productive use of an evening than arguing with them, and she retired to the drawing-room to sit by the fire and think, which she did, very quietly, for the better part of 2 hours, while around her the household continued its uneasy business of pretending to read, pretending to play cards, and pretending not to watch one another. It was during this long, quiet evening of thinking that Miss Marple made her second small error of the investigation, though, as with the first, she would not recognize it as an error until very much later, and when she did, she would feel rather sharply ashamed of herself for having made it. She had become, by this point, so thoroughly persuaded that the means of the murder, the impossible absence of footprints, must somehow be bound up with its timing, that she allowed herself to construct, with what she privately considered very creditable ingenuity, an elaborate theory involving a board laid across the snow, upon which a person might walk without leaving an impression, the board then withdrawn and the snow allowed to fall undisturbed over the place where it had lain. It was, she thought, turning the idea over with some satisfaction as she sat with her knitting, a thoroughly sound piece of reasoning, and she spent a not inconsiderable portion of the following morning attempting, with the assistance of a long-suffering Constable Hobbs, to locate any plank, board, or similar object about the property that showed signs of recent and curious use. She found nothing of the kind. The gardener's shed yielded only the ordinary clutter of rakes and flower pots. The outbuildings, searched with Hobbs's patient and increasingly puzzled cooperation, offered up nothing more sinister than a quantity of firewood and a great many spiders. "I am beginning to think, Constable," said Miss Marple, standing in the doorway of the empty tool shed, with snow melting unheeded on her shoulders, "that I have been very stupid indeed." "I'm sure not, miss," said Hobbs loyally, though he privately rather agreed with her, and was beginning to wonder what Inspector Reed would say when he learned how the morning had been spent. Miss Marple said nothing further on the subject, but walked back toward the house in a state of some private mortification, turning the problem over and over in her mind, like a woman shaking a locked box, in the hope that something inside it might rattle and give away its secret. It was not until she was very nearly at the door, brushing the snow from her coat, that a small thought occurred to her. Not the solution, not yet, but the first faint thread of it, that she had been thinking all this while about how a person might cross the snow without leaving a mark, when the truer and more interesting question was rather different. She stopped quite still on the doorstep, the cold momentarily forgotten. Perhaps, she thought slowly, no one had needed to cross the snow at all. She did not yet know what this meant. But she stood there long enough, thinking, that Dolly Hartwell, glancing out of the morning-room window, remarked to her husband that poor Jane seemed to have caught a chill standing about in the cold, and really oughtn't to be allowed to wander the grounds at her age without someone to look after her. Miss Marple, had she heard this remark, would have been quietly and considerably amused by it, but she did not hear it, being at that moment entirely absorbed in the slow, patient unfolding of an idea that was, though she did not yet know it, very nearly the truth. A mistake realized. It was Felicity Vane, of all people, who gave Miss Marple the thread that finally led her out of the maze of her own mistaken thinking. And she did it, characteristically, without the smallest notion that she had done anything significant at all. It happened over tea on Friday afternoon, the household having settled into the strange, suspended rhythm that descends upon a house where a murder has occurred and not yet been solved. Too anxious for ordinary conversation, too restless for silence, filling the hours instead with small, careful talk about nothing very much, while every person in the room privately wondered about every other. "I do think it's a shame about the orchard path," Felicity said, apropos of nothing at all, stirring her tea with more attention than the action strictly required. "Mr. Hartwell was telling me only last week how proud he was of it. The new flagstones, I mean, that he'd had laid in the autumn, right along the side lawn to the orchard gate. And now it's all under the snow and nobody can even see it, and the police have been tramping their great boots all over the flower beds instead of keeping to the path the way anybody sensible would." Miss Marple, who had been only half listening, set down her teacup with a small, precise click. "A path, my dear? Along the side lawn, the very lawn where poor Mr. Drummond was found?" "Oh yes," said Felicity, faintly surprised to find her idle remark commanding such close attention. "Henry had it put in during October, I believe. Flagstones set flush with the turf, so it wouldn't spoil the look of the lawn in summer. He was very particular about it. Gerald said it cost a perfectly absurd sum for something nobody would even notice once the grass grew over the edges." "Flush with the turf," Miss Marple repeated slowly, as though tasting the words, "so that a person walking upon it would scarcely seem to be walking upon a path at all, but simply across the lawn itself." "I suppose so, yes. Why does it matter?" "I am not entirely certain that it does, my dear," said Miss Marple, in the mild, faraway voice of a woman whose mind has gone somewhere a good deal more interesting than the drawing-room she is presently sitting in. "I am not entirely certain of anything at the moment. But I think, yes, I think I have been a very foolish old woman indeed. and I believe I had better go and look at that lawn again, snow or no snow." She did not go at once, however, for the light was failing, and Inspector Reed's constables, still stationed at intervals about the garden, showed every sign of taking a dim view of elderly ladies wandering about a crime scene after dark. Instead, she sat very still by the fire for the remainder of the evening, her knitting entirely forgotten in her lap, turning over in her mind the whole shape of the puzzle as it now appeared to her, and finding, with a small private discomfort that she did not enjoy in the least, that she had very probably been pursuing the wrong question from the very beginning. She had been asking herself how a person might cross open snow without leaving footprints, but if Henry Hartwell's new flagstone path ran directly across that lawn, flush with the turf, as Felicity had said, scarcely visible even in summer, and now entirely buried beneath the snowfall, then perhaps no one had crossed open snow at all. Perhaps someone had walked, quite ordinarily, along a hard stone path that lay concealed an inch or two beneath the white surface, where their footsteps would press the snow down without ever disturbing the ground beneath it enough to leave the kind of betraying impression one would expect from footprints in soft earth or grass. It was not, she admitted to herself, a complete answer. Snow was snow, after all, whether it lay over stone or over turf, and a footstep ought surely to leave some mark upon its surface regardless of what lay beneath. But it was, she felt with growing conviction, the beginning of an answer, the first loose thread in a knot she had been trying, quite uselessly, to untie from entirely the wrong end. And there was something else, too, something that nagged at her with increasing insistence as the evening wore on. She had been so very occupied with the question of means, with planks and paths and the physical mechanics of crossing snow, that she had rather lost sight of a piece of testimony given to her, freely and without prompting, on her very first evening at Larkspur Manor, by a person she had not, until this moment, thought to connect with it at all. She rang, a little before 9, for Annie, who came up looking pale and tired, as everyone in the house had looked pale and tired for some days now. "Annie, my dear, I wonder if I might ask you something. On the night Mr. Drummond died, when you came up to bed after banking the kitchen fire, can you tell me, did you happen to notice whether it was snowing very heavily at that time, or had it perhaps eased off a little?" Annie considered this with the careful, anxious thoroughness of a servant who has come to understand that her answers carry weight she had never expected them to carry. "It had eased off, miss, now you mention it. I remember because I stood at the scullery window a moment, looking out, and thinking how strange it was, the way it had nearly stopped after coming down so hard all evening, and then it started up again, something dreadful, not 20 minutes later. I remember it particular because I'd left the kitchen door on the latch for Mr. Drummond's man, who'd gone down to see to the car, and I had to go down again and check he'd come in safe, on account of the cold." "And what time would that have been, Anya, when it eased off?" "12:30, miss, near enough. I just heard the hall clock strike." Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment after Annie had gone, her hands folded in her lap, her sharp old eyes fixed on the dying fire. 12:30. A lull in the snowfall. Brief, but long enough, perhaps, for a person to cross a lawn along a path concealed beneath an inch of settled snow, and for that same person's footsteps, however lightly they fell upon a hard stone surface, rather than soft earth, to be filled in and smoothed away again within 20 minutes by the snow resuming its fall. It was not yet the whole truth. There remained the question of why Edmund Drummond himself had been out on that lawn at all, at 12:30 in the morning, in the midst of a snowstorm, when by every account he had retired to bed at a perfectly sensible hour along with the rest of the household. A man does not, after all, generally go walking in his nightclothes through a blizzard for no reason at all, and Miss Marple recalled, with a small unpleasant jolt, that the body had indeed been found in night attire, a detail she had noted on that first dreadful morning and had not, until this moment, thought to attach any particular significance to. Someone, she thought slowly, had got him out there, not carried. Inspector Reed's doctor had been quite firm that there had been no body brought across open ground, but persuaded, or summoned, in some manner that had seemed to Drummond himself entirely ordinary and unremarkable, so that he had gone out, alone, along a path he very likely did not even know was there beneath the snow, to meet someone he had no reason whatever to fear. And there, waiting for him in the brief lull of the storm, that someone had struck him down, and had then, Miss Marple suspected with a growing and most uncomfortable certainty, simply turned and walked back the way they had come, along the same hidden path, leaving the resuming Snowfall to do the rest of the work for them. It was, she thought, a very clever murder indeed, cleverer perhaps than she had given anyone in this gentle, anxious, grief-stricken household credit for being. She thought, too, with a small private wince of self-reproach, of how very nearly she had allowed Henry Hartwell's tearful confession and Gerald's gambling debts to settle the matter entirely in her own mind, days before she had thought to ask a frightened young housemaid the one simple question that mattered most. "I have been," she murmured to the empty room, "a very great fool. I do hope it is not too late to be a less foolish one." She went up to bed shortly afterward, but did not sleep for a long while, lying in the dark and listening, as she had listened on that first terrible night, to the soft, endless whisper of snow against the window pane, and thinking, with the patient, unhurried clarity that had served her well in St. Mary Mead for the better part of a lifetime, about precisely who in that house had known, before anyone else, exactly where Henry Hartwell's new flagstone path lay hidden beneath the white and innocent surface of the lawn. The truth beneath the snow. She woke before dawn, as old women often do, and lay for some minutes in the grey half-light, turning over the question that had carried her into sleep the night before. Who, besides Henry Hartwell himself, could have known about a path laid only in October, flush with the turf, and meant, by Felicity's own account, to be all but invisible once the grass had grown over its edges? It was not, she reflected, the kind of thing a casual visitor would notice. It was not even, necessarily, the kind of thing every member of the household would know. Colonel Ashworth, for instance, a neighbour rather than a resident, might very well have dined at Larkspur a dozen times without ever once being told of so small a domestic improvement as a new garden path. But someone who lived in the house, or who had spent a great deal of time in it over the autumn months, watching the work being done, asking the ordinary idle questions one asks of any building project on a friend's estate, that person would know. That person might even, Miss Marple thought, have walked the path themselves, in daylight, in October sunshine, long before the first snow ever fell, and have it fixed quite precisely in their memory, so many paces from the side door, bearing left past the old apple tree, running straight as a die to the orchard gate. She rose, dressed with her usual unhurried care, and went down before breakfast to find Inspector Reed already in the hall, shaking the snow from his coat, and looking, she thought, like a man who had slept very little and enjoyed it less. "Inspector, I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes of your time, and perhaps the loan of one of your constables and a long broom." Reed regarded her with the particular wary patience he had come, over the past 3 days, to reserve specifically for Miss Marple. "A broom, Miss Marple? If you would be so kind, I believe," she said, with the mildness of a woman remarking upon the likelihood of rain, "that I may know how Mr. Drummond came to cross that lawn without leaving a single footprint, and if I am right, I think the proof of it is still lying under the snow, waiting to be found." It took the better part of an hour, with Constable Hobbs sweeping with careful, methodical strokes along the line Miss Marple indicated, a line running, as she had suspected, directly from the side door across the lawn to the orchard gate, before the dark, even surface of flagstone began to emerge beneath the cleared snow, stone after stone, laid flush and true, exactly as Felicity Vane had described. "Well, I'm damned," said Reed, crouching to look more closely. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but I'm damned all the same. A path, right under it the whole time. It explains a very great deal, does it not?" said Miss Marple. "A person walking upon hard, frozen stone rather than upon soft turf would leave a far shallower impression than one might expect. And during the lull in the snowfall that Annie described to me, any mark that was left would have been filled in again within the half-hour, the new snow settling over the old in a manner indistinguishable, to the eye, from ground that had never been disturbed at all. It is not, I think, that no one crossed this lawn last night, Inspector. It is only that whoever did so chose their moment and their route, with very great care indeed. Reed straightened slowly, his breath clouding in the cold air, and looked at her with something that was no longer merely patience. Which means whoever killed Drummond knew about this path. Knew it well enough to walk it in the dark, in a snowstorm, without putting a foot wrong onto the turf on either side. Precisely so, Inspector. And I think you will find, said Miss Marple, that the list of people who might reasonably be expected to know of a garden path laid only this past October is a very much shorter list than the list of people who might wish Mr. Drummond ill. Colonel Ashworth, for instance, dines at Larkspur perhaps once a fortnight, and I should be very surprised indeed if Henry Hartwell troubled to walk him round the lawn discussing flagstones. But a member of the household, someone who had watched the work being done, who had perhaps walked the path themselves in October sunshine before ever a flake of snow had fallen, such a person would know it as well as they knew the stairs in their own home. Reed was silent for a moment, looking down at the dark, exposed stone, and then up at the house, its windows catching the thin morning light. You're thinking of young Hartwell, the debts, the quarrel, the wet boots. I had thought of him, certainly, said Miss Marple slowly. I confess I thought of very little else for some days, and I believe that was a mistake on my part. A natural one, perhaps, given how very damning the circumstances appeared, but a mistake nonetheless. I allowed a clear motive to persuade me that I need not look very much further for an explanation, when in fact the means of this murder were so very particular, so very deliberate, that I think we must ask not merely who wished Mr. Drummond dead, but who could have known, with real certainty, precisely where to lead him in the dark. Lead him, Reed repeated. You think he was lured out here? I am quite sure of it, Inspector. A man does not rise from his bed at midnight, in the middle of a snowstorm, and walk out in his nightclothes to the middle of an open lawn, for no reason at all. He went because someone asked him to, someone he trusted, or at the very least had no cause to fear, someone who could have knocked softly at his door, or sent a note beneath it, asking him to come down quietly, without waking the rest of the house, on some pretext that seemed to him entirely reasonable at the time. She paused. I think, too, that this same person knew the path was there, and knew also that the snow, for a little while at least, would do the work of hiding their tracks, rather better than any contrivance of boards or planks that I, in my foolishness, spent the better part of yesterday morning hunting for in your garden shed. Reed gave a short, unwilling laugh. Hobbs mentioned that. Hobbs, said Miss Marple, with a small twinkle that suggested she bore the constable no ill will whatever for his candour, was very patient with me, and I am grateful to him, even though we found nothing more sinister than spiders. She fell silent for a moment, looking down the long, dark line of exposed stone, stretching from the house to the orchard gate where, she now felt quite certain, someone had stood waiting on a snow-muffled midnight, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the old wall, watching the side door for a figure to emerge. There is one thing more I should like to know, Inspector, before I trouble you any further, she said. Has anyone in this house, to your knowledge, mentioned, even in passing, even as the smallest piece of idle conversation, that they walked this path, or watched it being laid, back in October? Reed considered. Not to me directly, but I can find out readily enough. He looked at her with an expression that had shifted, over the course of their conversation, from wary tolerance into something a good deal closer to respect. You've a particular person in mind, Miss Marple. I have a suspicion, Inspector, though I should be very sorry to name it before I am a great deal more certain than I am at present. I have already been wrong once in this matter, through being too quick to settle upon an answer that fitted the facts I happened to have in front of me, and I have no wish to make the same error twice, particularly not in a matter so very grave as this one. I think, she added, drawing her coat more closely about her against the cold, that I should like to speak to one or two members of the household again, quite informally, before anything further is said. People talk so very much more freely over tea than they ever do across a desk, Inspector. Even, perhaps especially, when the subject is murder." She left him there, by the dark stripe of stone cutting through the white lawn, and walked back toward the house with the slow, deliberate step of a woman who has very nearly, though not quite, completed a long and difficult piece of needlework and means to take the very greatest care over the last few stitches. Miss Marple speaks. She arranged it, with Dolly Hartwell's somewhat bewildered cooperation, for 4:30 that afternoon, tea in the drawing-room, the whole household present, on the pretext that Inspector Reed had asked for everyone to be gathered together. This was not, strictly speaking, untrue. Miss Marple had asked Inspector Reed to ask it, and he had agreed, with the resigned air of a man who has come, over the course of a difficult week, to understand that arguing with this particular elderly lady was a considerably less productive use of his time than simply doing as she suggested. The fire had been built up generously, and the tea things laid with Dolly's usual careful attention to small comforts, though the hands that had arranged the cups and saucers were not entirely steady, and the plate of sandwiches sat largely untouched. Outside, the light was already going. These December afternoons gave one so very little of it, and the lamps had been lit against the early dusk, lending the room a warmth and intimacy that sat oddly, Miss Marple thought, against the particular quality of silence in which 5 people waited to be told which one of them had committed murder. Henry Hartwell sat by the fire with his hands on his knees, his bluff, red-faced good cheer entirely gone now, replaced by a grey and frightened stillness. Dolly sat beside him, not touching him, but close. The closeness, Miss Marple thought, of a woman who has not forgiven her husband, but has not yet decided to abandon him either. Gerald and Felicity were side by side on the sofa, and there was something in their posture today that was different from every previous day. Not the careful distance of 2 people avoiding one another, but the pressed together, shoulder-to-shoulder solidarity of 2 people who have talked, honestly and at last, and found themselves on the same side of a difficult thing. And in the wing chair nearest the window, with his legs crossed and his teacup balanced with practiced ease upon his knee, sat Colonel Ashworth. He had the look, Miss Marple had thought all week, of a man in the habit of occupying rooms as though he owned them. That particular kind of ease, half military, half social, that comes from decades of being the most senior person present. He looked, as he had looked since the morning the body was found, entirely composed. It was, she thought, a composition very carefully maintained. Inspector Reed stood by the door, his notebook in his hand, looking as though he would rather be somewhere considerably warmer and less complicated. Miss Marple set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap. "I am aware," she began, in the quiet, conversational tone she might have used to open a discussion at the St. Mary Mead Women's Institute, "that I am only a guest in this house, and that it is not generally considered my place to speak in these matters. But Mrs. Hartwell has been my friend for a very great many years, and I find that friendship, at my age, is one of the very few things one considers absolutely non-negotiable." She smiled at Dolly, who looked as though she might cry. "I should like, if nobody objects, to tell you what I believe happened on the night Mr. Drummond died. Inspector Reed may correct me wherever I go wrong, though I rather hope he will find the occasions for correction few." Nobody objected. Nobody, Miss Marple suspected, was quite capable of it. "I made a number of mistakes in this matter," she said, with perfect composure. "And I think it is important to say so at the outset, because the truth of what happened here is a great deal less complicated than the path by which I arrived at it, and the complications were largely of my own making. I was too quick to follow the obvious threads: financial difficulty, gambling debts, quarrels with the dead man, and too slow to ask myself the one question that mattered most. Not who wished Mr. Drummond dead, but who could have known, with sufficient precision, exactly where to walk on that lawn in the dark, without leaving a single mark in the snow." She paused, and in the pause the fire shifted and settled with a soft sound. "There is a flagstone path," she continued, running from the side door of this house, across the lawn where Mr. Drummond was found, to the orchard gate. It was laid in October, by Mr. Hartwell's instruction, and it lies flush with the turf, all but invisible, even in summer, and buried completely beneath last week's snowfall. A person who knew that path was there, who knew it well enough to walk it in the dark, in a snowstorm, without once straying from the stone onto the soft ground on either side, could have crossed that lawn and left impressions so shallow, pressed as they were into snow resting on hard stone rather than soft earth, that a brief resumption of the snowfall would erase them entirely. It was not a miracle, and it was not an impossibility. It was simply a very intimate knowledge of this particular piece of ground, used with considerable deliberation. Now, she went on, her eyes moving gently but without hesitation to the wing chair by the window. Who in this household possessed that intimate knowledge? Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, certainly. Gerald, who has lived here the better part of his life, and who walked that path with his own father in October when it was newly laid. Yes, he told me so himself, though without any notion of its significance, when I asked him yesterday quite casually about the garden improvements. And one other person, someone who came to dine at Larkspur, by his own account, very regularly indeed, once a fortnight, throughout the autumn months, and who was present in September when the plans for the path were first discussed at a Sunday dinner, and who remarked then, as Gerald also recalled for me, that it was a fine idea, and why hadn't Henry done it years ago? Colonel Ashworth had not moved. His teacup was still balanced upon his knee with the same practiced ease, and his expression had not changed in any way that a casual observer would have noticed. But Miss Marple was not a casual observer, and she saw, quite clearly, the thing that happened in his eyes in the moment before composure closed over it again. Something cold and calculating, and wholly unlike the bluff, choleric, half-comic figure he had been presenting to this household for the better part of a week. You will say, Miss Marple continued, still in the same quiet, conversational tone, that motive is another matter, but I think Inspector Reed will find, when he looks into it, and I believe he has begun to look already, that Mr. Drummond's professional concerns were not limited to the affairs of this household. Mr. Drummond was Colonel Ashworth's solicitor too, and had been for many years, and I think there was something in that long professional acquaintance that the Colonel found, by last December, very much more urgently alarming than any gambling debt or family embarrassment. Something, perhaps, which Mr. Drummond had communicated to the Colonel in writing, which explains, I should think, why the Colonel was so very particular on the evening of his arrival about ensuring that his bedroom door had a good lock on it. That is a great deal of supposition, said Ashworth. His voice was steady. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a remarkable kind of steadiness, not the blankness of innocence, but the controlled, deliberate calm of a man who has known for several days that this moment was coming and has had time to prepare himself for it. It is, she agreed pleasantly. A great deal of what I have said this afternoon is supposition, Colonel, and I would not for a moment pretend otherwise. The proof, the physical proof, the correspondence, the financial records that I suspect Mr. Drummond had brought with him to discuss with Mr. Hartwell, and which have not, I believe, been found among his effects. That is a matter for Inspector Reed and his colleagues, and it is a great deal beyond my own small abilities. But there is one thing I am not supposing at all. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and drew out a small object, which she set on the table beside her teacup with the quiet care of a woman placing the final piece into a finished puzzle. It was a button, dark green, military cut, with a small anchor embossed upon it. The kind of button found on a particular style of shooting coat, the sort a man might wear to walk a country estate in autumn and early winter. Constable Hobbs found this, said Miss Marple, this morning, when the path was fully cleared, in the crevice between two flagstones, approximately 12 feet from the orchard gate. I noticed, when you arrived on the night of the storm, Colonel, that you were wearing your shooting coat, the one now hanging in the hall, which is missing, I believe, one of its lower buttons. I noticed it quite early on, in fact, and then forgot about it entirely, which I am sorry to say is the sort of lapse one becomes rather more susceptible to with age. She said this last without any particular emphasis, and it produced the small and oddly domestic effect she had intended. For 3 of the 5 people in that room, despite themselves, despite everything, glanced at the button, and at one another, and the tension in the room shifted imperceptibly from the terrible, suspended fear of people waiting to hear something dreadful, into something rather more solid and rather more final. Colonel Ashworth looked at the button for a long moment. Then he looked at Miss Marple. Then, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided, at last, that the role he has been playing is no longer worth the effort it costs him, he set his teacup very carefully on the side table, uncrossed his legs, and said, quite calmly, "I should like to speak to my own solicitor, I think, before I say anything further." "That seems very wise, Colonel," said Inspector Reed, and moved away from the door. It was much later, nearly 9 o'clock, the house quiet at last, in the particular exhausted quiet that follows a long and difficult thing having been concluded, that Dolly Hartwell found Miss Marple in the sitting-room by the library, her knitting in her lap, the fire burned low, her expression that of a woman not quite at peace, but doing her reasonable best in that direction. "Jane," said Dolly, sitting down beside her, "I don't know how to thank you." "You might begin," said Miss Marple, with a small, tired smile, "by never again inviting me to a house party, with quite so much drama in it. I am really not as young as I was." Dolly gave a laugh that was also rather nearly a sob, and pressed her old friend's hand, and for a while they sat together without speaking, the fire settling, the snow outside beginning, very softly, to fall again, covering the garden path, covering the orchard gate, covering all the dark and complicated evidence of what human beings, under sufficient pressure, are capable of doing to one another. But not, Miss Marple thought, looking at the white and peaceful lawn from the darkened window, not hiding it entirely. The snow had done its best, and its best had been very nearly good enough. Not quite, though, not quite.